Hi, I'm Thelma English. Welcome back to American Lit, session 25 out of 31. If you want to see the rest of the sessions, they are all on YouTube. These are being recorded in 2023, and www.thelma's library has the materials you need as far as quizzes and note sets and handouts and things like that. You'll have to contact me email if you are a teacher and would like all the answer copies at thelma@thelmaslibrary.com. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are so grateful to be able to legally home educate here in Oregon. We pray for all of those who fight so hard for us to retain this freedom. We thank the parents who have resolved to teach at home and who have searched out to find classes like this one. And I pray that for each individual watching this class, that they would be blessed. In Jesus' name, amen. We are focusing on a couple of various authors. You can go ahead and pause the video and let your volunteer from last week read a selection from Valley of Vision. Okay. You can tell I like Anne Bradstreet. I like to not forget her as the year goes on. And as she says, if we had no winter, the spring would not be so pleasant. If we did not sometimes taste of adversity, prosperity would not be so welcome. Excuse me. By now you've figured out that I have major problems with my voice. So recording is sometimes difficult for me. Session 25, schedule review. You're turning in your Huck Finn project today. I hope that some of those are really bulky and fun. I hope that you wrote your project on the back of a grocery bag and had little tear marks all around the edges, or I had a student do the method where you burn the very edge to make it look old, but that does make the ash come off on my fingers, but that's okay. And I've had those turned in on jeans and on shirts and on wood, all types of things. I hope you had some fun with that. We are going to have a quiz on the last part of Huck Finn. We didn't take time for that last week, but I'm sure you finished reading the story anyway. Our reading this week is varied. We are reading from Great American Short Stories. Mine looks like this. Yours might have a different cover on it. Now, Great American Short Stories, GASS. And I will refer sometimes to our slides from it'll on a slide. It'll just say capital G, capital A, capital S, the GAS. And that's just standing for Great American Short Stories. We're also reading from our 101 Great American Poems. And I think your cover is also different from mine because mine are older versions. You'll be reading two short stories, Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and you'll be reading Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart. These are published within 10 years of one another, but by different people and completely different writers, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe. We'll look at them today. And you're also reading from the 101 Great American Poems from Walt Whitman, Oh Captain, My Captain. And of course, we read that earlier. It's about Abraham Lincoln, but that's assigned reading this week. And then Emily Dickinson, Stopping for Death. I could not stop for death, so he stopped for me. We've read that. I think this will be your third time reading that. And then we'll be looking at Poe's The Raven this week. And I believe this is the first time I've assigned you to read that. And of course, poetry gets assigned over and over because you will get more out of it every time you read it. You do have syllabus reading about Hawthorne and other various authors from this time period. You'll be reading about Walt Whitman also, and you'll be reading a little bit about naturalism because that's quickly approaching. Your assignment this week, your writing assignment, are vocabulary. words. You've got a long list of vocabulary words, and you're going to define those as used in the story context. So if a vocabulary word has 3 definitions, you are going to give the definition that fits in the story context. And your assignment paper has the page numbers on it so that you can find those in the story. I suggest defining all of the words, even though it appears random, defining all the words first. Then you'll have it on your computer, and then as you read through the story, you can figure out which of the meanings fits the story context, and you can erase the others from your computer document. But that way you'll know what the word means when you get to it. And that is due next week, the vocabulary words. Your teacher may ask you to also include the word in a sentence, because sometimes just defining the word, that can all be cut and paste from a computer now. And so to have you actually use the word, we sometimes ask you to also write a sentence using the word, and not just a sentence that says listing means to lean over. Listing is a term that boaters use to mean the boat is leaning one direction. You would have to explain it with a more explanatory sentence like that. You can't define the word with itself. In other words, dipping means to dip. That you can't do that. That's you have to define it in context. And new this time around are Thelma read-alouds. These are kind of tricky stories for some students. Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne is a great story if you want to listen to me read it aloud and explain what's going on. That's 34 minutes. And then The Telltale Heart is only 15 minutes long. Those are both very short stories, but there are Thelma read-alouds available now, which will really bless you, because I do explain. I will even tell you what a difficult vocabulary words is. I'll say the word, and then I'll give you another word that means the same thing that you will probably understand, so you don't have to look it up before you get going. Excuse me. These were recorded just 2 years ago, and so they're relatively new. Huck Finn, you've got a quiz to take, and it is over Huckleberry Finn, and then a little bit of lecture material. Go ahead and pause the audio and take your quiz now, please. Okay, moving on. That wasn't too difficult, was it? Mark Twain. We're going to look a little more at Samuel Clemens' life before we just leave Mark Twain completely behind, almost. Mark Twain is a fascinating person. His personal story from 1835 to 1910, his personal story is one of love and one of loss. This is Twain with his wife and his 3 daughters. Of course, he was famous during his lifetime, so he was photographed quite a bit. This is not his hair sticking up here. This is young Samuel Clemens wearing a hat. He's probably a teenager here. And you can see his belt buckle says Sam, or something he's holding says Sam, which is kind of cute. He had a favorite word whenever he described his boyhood home of Hannibal, Missouri. He called it a drowsing type of place. Clemens would later call these his Tom Sawyer days, a time when he himself pulled many of the pranks he later attributed to his young Nero. Now, you as a child probably don't run around pulling a lot of pranks and things. My generation, now I never pulled pranks because I had a very serious childhood. I was in charge of my younger brother and sister as soon as I got home from school. In fact, I'd walk down to the babysitter and get my little brother when I was 8 and he was 1, and I would carry him home, and I was in charge of he and my little sister. And so I didn't think about going and pulling pranks and doing things like that. Whereas my husband had a much more colorful childhood. His mother didn't watch him closely at all. And so he was outside all day. And some of his friends did pull pranks and things like that. And he got involved in those. And so he did have a few Tom Sawyer days, but don't feel bad. If you are a more serious child and being raised seriously, I actually think that is a better way to grow up. And that's the way I raised my kids, although I didn't have them babysit. He lived in Hannibal from the age of 4 to 15, and he relived those days for the rest of his life in books like Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and Life on the Mississippi. I think that's a good American goal, to live a childhood that you kind of relive and retell the stories of for the rest of your life. I Most of my childhood stories are quite boring. My husband has some lively childhood stories, but our boys, who were raised with two parents and raised on half an acre and raised with a big fort thing on 8-foot poles. It was 8 feet in the sky, and it was a 10 by 10 fort that you could only get into if you could climb a rope. So little kids couldn't get up there, and they spent half their days up there, either doing their homework or bird watching or coloring or drinking cocoa. We ran an electrical line through the trees out to their fort, so they had electricity and they had water in a bottle and cocoa in a Tupperware and all of that. And both of my boys tell me that they believe they had a wonderful childhood. And that, of course, would be home education. I hope you are having that kind of childhood, one that you will tell and retell to your children for the rest of your life. Twain was one of 7 children, but only 3 survived childhood. You know, these are the old days, the 1800s, the early 1900s. This is before incredible medical intervention at childbirth and childhood diseases and vaccines and things like that. His attorney, also a judge father, died of pneumonia when Twain was only 11. And so he had to quit school and begin working. People still die of pneumonia, but not very often. Most people here in America go and get antibiotics and get cured from pneumonia, unless they also have other mitigating factors. But my grandpa, who was born in 1904, I believe, he had to quit school and begin working because his mother had diabetes, and there was no insulin for diabetes. You just got thinner and thinner and kind of starved to death. And so the boys all quit school and went to work and took care of their mother. These were hard times. These were tough lives. And so he quit school and he began working right away. When I was a boy, said Clemens in the Atlantic Monthly, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of that Mississippi River, and that was to be a steamboat man. So they all live on the river, and all the kids, they just want to be a steamboat guy. And this postcard that he's written to somebody says, "Be good, you will be lonesome." He always had some kind of smart aleck, funny thing to say. And he did become a riverboat pilot. This is his license from the 1850s. He became one of the best pilots on the Mississippi River. Your pilot cares nothing about anything on earth but the river, and his pride in his occupation surpasses the pride of kings. And that quote is from his book, Life on the Mississippi. Twain went west to avoid the brewing Civil War. He didn't want to be in Mississippi, so he went west. That's a lot of people went west during that time. They did not want to become part of that Civil War. And the Civil War stopped steamboat travel anyway. Clemens took his first writing job as reporter at the Virginia City Territorial Enterprise with his brother Orion. Orion had been offered the position of secretary of the new territory. It wasn't a state, it was territory. And Samuel wanted to try his luck at silver mining. When mining didn't pan out, Clemens became a newspaper reporter. His first article under the pen name Mark Twain was published in the Nevada Territorial Enterprise in February of 1863. This is right in the middle of the Civil War. In 1864, Clemens left Nevada and headed for the California gold fields. Then he was sent off to Hawaii. I lost my text here, then called the Sandwich Islands. If you can read this, this is it's not a photocopy, it's a reproduction. I had a photocopy of this, but it isn't very readable. And so I found a reproduction. They were then called the Sandwich Islands. So his editor sent him all over the world, and he ends up in Hawaii. They're called the Sandwich Islands then. And it says, Honolulu correspondent of the Sacramento Union so Mark Twain will deliver a lecture on the Sandwich Islands at the Academy of Music on Tuesday evening, October 2, in which passing mention will be made of Paris, a few people, American missionaries, and the absurd customs and characteristics of the natives, duly discussed and described. So he's going to make fun of all the Hawaiians. The great volcano of Kilauea will also receive proper attention. A splendid orchestra is in town but has not been engaged. Also, a din of ferocious wild beasts will be on exhibition in the next block. Magnificent fireworks were in contemplation for this occasion, but the idea has been abandoned. A grand torchlight procession may be expected. In fact, the public are privileged to expect whatever they please. So in big print, they have all these wonderful things they might see. And then in the little print, it tells you, well, that's not really going to happen here, which is quite funny. So doors open at 7 o'clock, the trouble to begin at 8. And that was very typical of Twain. So his Hawaiian lectures, the subject was Hawaii, and then called the Sandwich Islands. And he had been there for 6 months. He got $20 every time he sent a letter to his newspaper publisher, and then they would publish the letter because they were so funny. For that first lecture or stand-up comedy show, that's what we would call it now, not a lecture. We'd call it stand-up comedy. He was very nervous. So he made up a poster with these words at the bottom: the doors will be open at 7:30, the trouble will begin at 8. It was the beginning of a lifelong success for the performer that we know as Mark Twain. Now, Mark Twain Tonight. There's only one video of the real Mark Twain, and of course it doesn't have sound and it's pretty poor quality. If I could have found it, I would have included it in this PowerPoint, but there is an impersonator, or there was an impersonator, Hal Holbrook, in the 1950s, and he had a show he called Mark Twain Tonight, and he would go from place to place and just talk like Mark Twain, quoting Mark Twain, redoing some of Mark Twain's shows. And he looked like Mark Twain, and he dressed like Mark Twain, and he smoked a cigar like Mark Twain. He did all of that, Hal Holbrook. And so he portrays him, and he does all these recitations. I bought that at one time. Of course, it's a VCR, and it's 90 minutes long, so it kind of gets a little boring just watching it. But you can look him up on YouTube, and there are multiple clips. I'd like you to take that as an assignment, to look up on YouTube Hal Holbrook, Mark Twain Tonight, and look at a couple of clips, because he does such a good job of impersonation. And that kind of gives you an idea of Mark Twain's timing and his presentation method for what we now call stand-up comedy. He spent nearly 20 years in his strange riverboat of a house that he built in Connecticut, Hartford, Connecticut. He lived here 20 years. It does kind of look like a riverboat. It was the most well-known dwelling in Nook Farm, an elite neighborhood full of New England writers and intellectuals. So they would all see each other at parties and have parties with one another, and they all lived there. We don't even have a bunch of intellectual writers now. Mark Twain, The Innocents Abroad. Due to money problems, Twain lived in Europe from 1891 to 1901 for 10 years because he owed money and he just had to earn money. But that wasn't his first or his last trip abroad. From the age of 17 to the last few weeks of his life, he loved to travel. He crisscrossed the Atlantic more than a dozen times. He also went to Turkey, to Palestine, Hawaii, the Sandwich Islands, Australia, India, and South Africa. He traveled the entire world. A number of his trips were undertaken with a book or a series of articles in mind, or to secure international copyright. In the 1890s, he was driven to Europe and then around the world by heavy financial burdens and in search of health for his family and himself. Travel was not only an escape and a refreshment, it was sometimes, for literary or for personal reasons, a necessity. If you're a comedian, you can only give your show so many times in the American States. You need to travel abroad. They want to hear you too, just like comedians today. The first American pilgrims going to the Holy Land arrived in 1819. This is quite funny. And this is where Twain gets his material for The Innocents Abroad, a book that is quite funny. You can see him, he's in the circle. So he's sitting down kind of behind this lady's dress. But you can still tell that's him, even with this grainy photo. When you're talking about arriving in the Holy Land in 1819, uh, this is really amazing. And then Twain, 1866, himself set off to see the Holy Land. And this is quite a big deal because Israel in 1866 doesn't look like much of anything. If you might remember, in the ancient days, the Israelites got taxed by some of their enemies by how many trees they had on the land. And a lot of trees got cut down, and Jews were driven out, and the land was just overused and abused. And Israel was not beautiful. It wasn't the land that we read about in the Bible. But after 1947, when Israel became a nation again, became a state of their own and a nation of their own, they changed everything. They are now world leaders in desalinization of water, using salt water and taking the salt out of it. They have that Iron Dome so that, because they have rockets coming in from the Palestinians every single day of the year, just blind rockets coming in, and they shoot down all of those things. They have incredible technology, and the land is fertile and green and lush. Again, it's a beautiful place. But when Twain went there in 1866, I don't think it looked like much. This is the steamship, the Quaker City steamboat, which is crazy when you think about traveling that way. He was naturally satirical. He made fun of everything. He was critical of everything. The new religious tourism going to Israel was perfect for Samuel Clemens' natural tendency toward ridicule, especially against religion. Twain, remember, think about Huckleberry Finn. Yes, he's going to make fun of everything religious. Twain boarded the Quaker City to go to Israel. Israel basically was still infertile and dry. Twain agreed to write 51 short articles during the journey, and this collection of letters is what later became Innocents Abroad. Twain's pen was his lash. He called the trip, he said, it's a funeral procession without a corpse. The religious people in the group were offended by his impious gambling, his drinking, his smoking. All the readers loved him. His trip lasted 6 months. Travelers were issued a visa by the Ottoman Empire upon arrival in Constantinople. That's the city that's now called Istanbul in Asia, just across from Asia Minor, across the Hellespont from Asia Minor. So if you can figure out where that is, this is his passport, which is kind of cool. And this is cool. Twain purchased a Bible for his mother. And you can see it says Mount Calvary, September 24, 1867. And in the middle is written in Hebrew, Yerushalayim. And so you go from right to left. If you took Old Testament survey and you have a little bit of your Hebrew left, you can kind of tell Yerushalayim, which is kind of cool. Lacking the religious respect and devotion of the other travelers, Twain was not impressed with what he saw. Other people got really impressed. The further we went, the hotter the sun got, and the more rocky and bare, repulsive and dreary the landscape became. There was hardly a tree or a shrub anywhere. Even the olive and the cactus, those fast friends of a worthless soil, had almost deserted the country. Amazing what he could do with his pen. Perched on eternal hills, white and domed, and white and domed and massed together and hooped with high gray walls, the venerable city gleamed in the sun, so small. Why, it was no larger than an American village of 4,000 inhabitants. Tears would have been out of place to cry over it. The thought of Jerusalem being the place of poetry, sublimity, and more with all the dignity didn't find their appropriate expression and the emotions. He did not find appropriate expressions and emotions here in Jerusalem. I obviously printed my letters too light. After getting out of debt, Twain had become America's most popular celebrity. Everybody knew who Mark Twain was. He was invited to attend ship launchings, anniversary gatherings, political conventions, countless dinners. Reporters hounded him for new quips from the famous humorist. And of course, they were just hoping he'd say something funny that they could quote and put in their paper. To enhance his image, he started wearing white suits and he loved to take strolls down the street. And remember, I mentioned before, this is the Victorian age when everybody's wearing black, and he just simply chose to wear white. That's his signature. This is also the time of great tragedy for Samuel Clemens. Their only son, Langdon, was born premature, and he was always kind of sick. Who knows what he had? Died at 19 months old in 1872 of diphtheria. These are things that are erased from America now, diseases like diphtheria, because we have vaccinations. And it's a horrible way to die. And then Twain's mother, Jane, died in 1890. This is Twain with his daughters, Clara and Susie. Susie began a biography of her amazing father at age 13. She talks just like a 13-year-old today. My amazing father. She started writing a biography of him. Olivia, also called Susie because the wife is also named Olivia, died in 1896 at age 24 of spinal meningitis. That was a thing. No antibiotics. Spinal meningitis was a thing. This is Twain with two of his three daughters. Clara was the only child to survive her father. She suffered depression and she cared for her sick mother, Olivia, and then her sister Susie, who was sick. Clara ended up marrying twice. She had one daughter who never had children, and then she died in 1966 at age 55. And so there are no direct descendants of Twain. Jane Clemens, Twain's youngest child, dark-haired little girl, was born in 1880, and most people called her Jean, not Jane. Twain did not record her life as he had the others. She was diagnosed with epilepsy at age 15, but he didn't write about her. I think it was too painful. He traveled much looking for cures. They went all over the place. After her mother died, then nobody was as careful with her. And if you know about epilepsy, you kind of need to have somebody there all the time. So when her mother died, her care wasn't as careful. And she actually died. She drowned in the bathtub after just decorating the house for Christmas in 1909 at age 29, either seizures or from a heart attack, something with the epilepsy. But she had decorated the house, went and got in the bathtub, age 29, and then drowned because something happened there and there was nobody nearby to notice. This is a cool picture because you just don't see pictures from 110 years ago of little children with their dog. And that's what these little children are doing. They're playing. It's not a posed professional photo. So here is Clara, Sam, Mark Twain, Jean, Livy, which would be Olivia, and then Susie Clemens. So the children, Clara, Jean, and Susie. Mark Twain and his daughter Susie here. He is playing Leander from Hero and Leander. So his daughter Susie is playing Hero, or it looks like he's playing Hero. I don't know, or maybe he's Leander. But this is pulled from Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Twain loved to improvise, and it's really amazing. Most of us don't have the photos like this from the early 1900s, but Twain does. They had cameras. Then his brother Orion died in 1897. He's had a lot of loss, but people then did. Twain, and this is Twain in 1903 with that lifelong friend, John Lewis, who was the inspiration for Jim and Huckleberry Finn. I know I showed this to you last week. This is Twain with one of his 30 cats. I've read that he had more than 30 cats. Interesting, isn't it? And this is Twain's wife, Olivia, who died in 1904 after they'd been married for 34 years. Then his sister died in 1904. Twain outlived all 6 of his siblings, and that would be really tough, that you're the last sibling alive also. And then his daughter Jean died in 1909. When Olivia died in 1904, this is just a huge monumental event in Twain's life to lose his wife. He was very much in love with his wife. And typical to Mark Twain, the way he expressed himself was to start writing letters. And this is from one of the letters. Last night at 9:30, I entered Mrs. Clemens' room to say the usual good night. and that she was dead, though no one knew it. She had been cheerfully talking a moment before. She was sitting up in bed. She had not lain down for months because she couldn't breathe, and Katie and the nurse were supporting her. They supposed she had fainted, and they were holding the oxygen pipe to her mouth, expecting to revive her. I bent over her and looked in her face, and I think I spoke. I was surprised and troubled that she did not notice me. Then we understood, and our hearts broke. How poor we are today. Amazing that he's writing a letter the next day, and a letter to W.D. Howells, another famous man from that era. And in another letter, written an hour after her death, he says, "An hour ago, the best heart that ever beat for me and mine went silent out of this house, and I am as one who wanders and has lost his way. She who is gone was our head. She was our hands. We are now trying to make plans. We who have never made a plan before, nor ever needed to. If she could speak to us, then she would make it all simple and easy with a word, and our perplexities would vanish away. If she had known she was near to death, she would have told us where to go and what to do. But she was not suspecting. Neither were we. She was all our riches, and she is gone. She was our breath. She was our life. And now we are nothing." In a letter to R.W. Gilder. Really amazing, that loss. And this is him a year later at his 70th birthday bash. And I kind of think you can tell by the photo that it's sure not as much fun to go to his 70th birthday party without Olivia. But cool clothes. And then this is Mark Twain 1 year before his death. Just 1 year before his death. And you can tell he's getting a little older here. When Twain died on April 21, 1910, newspapers around the country declared the whole world is mourning. By then, Sam Clemens had long ceased to be a private citizen. He had become Mark Twain, a proud possession of the American nation. And actually, people all over the world mourned his passing because they knew there could never be another Mark Twain. There just couldn't be another Mark Twain. Amazing, isn't it? And Samuel Langhorne Clemens, it says on his headstone here, but in bigger letters, Mark Twain, because that's how people knew him. Okay, we are going to move on here to American poets, and we're going to highlight Walt Whitman in a poem called "I Hear America Singing." Go ahead and get out your 101 Great American Poems, and this is on page 22. He's a more unusual writer. I think you'll really enjoy Walt Whitman. "I Hear America Singing" is a celebration of diversity, of work, and of democracy in America. He's so pleased. And just think, he lived through the Civil War, and he has lived through all of that, come across on the other side, and he doesn't know about World War I coming up in 1914 yet. That's not quite brewing anything in America yet. And so he's feeling quite hopeful and just celebrating everything that makes America America. It's very unique because Walt Whitman is unique. He says in this poem, everybody has a unique voice, a unique occupation, and because in America, everybody has the right to pursue their own happiness with equal opportunity. They can say whatever they want. Similar to that AME church that we talked about last week, Whitman evokes those ideas of self-education, self-reliance. Self-reliance is really a big deal in America. You can get educated here and you can rely on yourself. You can do it yourself. And then community empowerment in his poems. He has the same things. He reflects the diversity that makes America a miracle in the day-to-day freedoms that we enjoy. And of course, miracle is going to be the name of one of the poems we're going to look at. So let's go to page 22 of your 101 American Poems. It's down at the bottom of the page, and he says, "I hear America singing. I hear America singing. The varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing him as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing him as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, and the deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench, the hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon intermission, or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to no one else. Of the day that belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs. Isn't that amazing? We think of that more as just a written paragraph. But for Walt Whitman, you have the advantage of another 100 years of time passing, whereas Walt Whitman is 130 years ago at his death. And he saw America evolving to be this amazing place. Another poem by Walt Whitman, I Sit and Look Out. And this is on page 23 in 101 American poems. And it also is a short poem. In this poem, Whitman exposes and condemns the injustice and the cruelty of mankind. He's critiquing American society. And he says we're falling short of the democratic ideals that he was singing about just a little bit when he heard Americans singing. He says we're not quite living up to that. So he's challenging the reader to pursue justice. Let's see what he says in this poem, I Sit and Look Out. I sit and look out upon all the sorrows of the world and upon all oppression and shame. I hear secret convulsive sobs from young men at anguish with themselves, remorseful after deeds done. I see in low life the mother misused by her children, dying, neglected, gaunt, desperate. I see the young wife misused by her husband. I see the treacherous seducer of young women. I mark the ranklings of jealousy and unrequited love attempted to be hid. I see these sights on the earth. I see the workings of battle, pestilence, tyranny. I see martyrs and prisoners. I observe a famine at sea. I observe the sailors casting lots. Who shall be killed to preserve the lives of the rest? I observe the slights and degradations cast by arrogant persons upon laborers, the poor, and upon Negroes and the like. All these, all the meanness and agony without end, I sit looking out upon, see, hear, and am silent. Okay, what do you think of that poem? It really is a beautiful poem. He's kind of challenging. He says, just observe, just sit and look out and observe what you see. And surely we can change something. Pick any one of those and help make a change. I always try to encourage my sons to be volunteers. We should all be volunteering somewhere at most times in our life. If you're a young mother with the challenge of lots of little children, then that may not apply because you are ministering right there in your home. But as we get older, and if you are a teen, you're old enough to volunteer. All right, what about Walt Whitman and his poem, Miracles? I especially like this poem because I kind of agree with him about everything, every little thing in life being a miracle. And here, Whitman celebrates nature and the beauty of just everyday life. I think too many people don't see the beauty in everyday life. They're looking for big things to happen, and they don't appreciate all the little things. So he's calling for us to be to express gratitude, and he does express gratitude to possibly some kind of spiritual being. Nobody knows if Whitman was a Christian or not. He grew up as a Quaker, but he seems to not have enjoyed organized religion later in his life. But I think he still believes in a supreme deity. He's trying to get us to appreciate all those little things, and that truly is a miracle. So let's take a look at this poem, Miracles. It starts on the bottom of page 23. Miracles. Why, who makes much of a miracle? As to me, I know of nothing else but miracles. And that's where I agree with Walt Whitman. I don't know anything except miracles. Every day, every bit is a miracle. Whether I walk the streets of Manhattan or dart my sights over roofs of houses toward the sky, or wade with naked feet along the beach, just in the edge of the water, or stand under trees in the woods, or talk by day with anyone I love, or sleep in the bed at night with anyone I love, or sit at table at dinner with the rest, or look at strangers opposite me riding in the car, or watch honeybees busy around the hive of a summer forenoon, or animals feeding in the fields, or birds, or the wonderfulness of insects in the air, or the wonderfulness of the sundown, or of stars shining so quiet and bright, or the exquisite, delicate, thin curve of the new moon in spring. These, with the rest, one and all, are to me miracles, the whole referring, yet each distinct and in its place. To me, every hour of the light and dark is a miracle. Every cubic inch of space is a miracle. Every square yard of the surface of the earth is spread with the same. Every foot of the interior swarms with the same. To me, the sea is a continual miracle. The fishes that swim, the rocks, the motion of the waves, the ships with men in them. What stranger miracles are there? Isn't that amazing? He is just expressing the idea that life itself, all of life is a miracle. And I think we would do well to look at life and nature in this way. As Christians, of course, we look through nature. If you took Brit Lit, we look through nature to nature's God. And that's the way we appreciate nature. What a poet. What words. Okay, next, we're going to look at Edgar Allan Poe. Your 101 Great American Poems probably looks like this. It has a picture of Robert Frost on the front, and we won't get to Robert Frost until the end of the year because he's actually quite a modern poet. But we'll be looking at The Raven in a few minutes. It's also in 101 Great American Poems. It's on page 16. It's quite a long poem. We'll just read part of it. Edgar Allan Poe was another Gothic, or what we call a dark romantic author. His works include multiple short stories exploring paranormal psychological experiences. So he really enjoys things that are dark, looking at the dark side of human nature. He wasn't popular during his short lifetime. You can see by the dates here that he only lived to be 40. But his works have become posthumously famous. He's quite famous now, and people really enjoy kind of dark stories and scary stories more. So he's more popular now. His mother died shortly after her husband abandoned the family in 1810. So as a baby, he was taken in by some friends. He attended a little bit of college. He enlisted in the army. He got thrown out of college. He enlisted in the army. He got thrown out of the army. He began writing, and he moved frequently, and he wrote for periodicals, what we now call magazines. He married his 13-year-old first cousin, Virginia Clem, in 1835. It was 10 years before his first successful publication, which was The Raven. And then poor Virginia died of TB 2 years later. TB was a horrible disease. It can be cured with a course of antibiotics now, but you just cough and you never quit coughing. I've actually been tested for TB a couple of times. Marrying your 13-year-old cousin, I know all the girls are thinking, ew, ew, ew. There are quite a few stories on the internet about him marrying his 13-year-old cousin, and why they were obviously in love. It's too bad he was 27, but when she was 13. But that's the way things were way back then. By age 40 in 1849, he was dead. He was discovered by his brother-in-law. He was drunk and incoherent in a street gutter. They pulled him into the house, but he died a few days later. He never recovered. So Poe had quite the drinking problem, and it took his brain cells, it took his mind, and it made him think in very dark ways. The Telltale Heart, of course, it makes his stories absolutely amazing. that he lost all these brain cells and had a very dark perspective on life. These are scary stories. You don't want to read these at night, but The Telltale Heart is really a genius of writing. I hope that you're going to enjoy it. And of course, there's a Thelma read aloud so that I can give it a little bit of drama as we go. The narrator insists so strongly that he is sane. When he's telling the story of The Telltale Heart, he kind of induces a near hysteria if you're reading that story aloud, so that his 1800s audience would be shivering and realize he's going on and on and on about how he's sane. And they would realize, oh my goodness, this guy's insane. Poe's poems usually explore death, despair, or the macabre. He reflects a fear of the unknown and superstition. The Raven and The Telltale Heart are among his best works, and we're reading those. Poe's childhood, I mentioned before, was very troubled, and he lived with friends and, was thrown out of school. Everything was marked by loss and poverty. Orphaned at that young age, struggling with alcoholism, and then severe depression most of his life, probably from alcoholism. Or perhaps he was somebody who would have been clinically depressed and then self-medicated himself with alcohol. It's hard to say at this point in time, 100 years later almost. His writing explores what I call dark romanticism. It's eerie. He likes irrational behavior, like the guy in The Telltale Heart, and the criminal mind, or insanity, or night terrors. These are all things he suffered with. He's a master of visual imagery. His words are filled with symbolism. He really is a genius with words and complex symbolism. The Raven is filled with not only an eerie atmosphere, but he also utilizes the classic Greek words. If you took New Testament survey, you learned a little bit of Greek. The Greek words oude, and those are from Sophocles, one of the three great Greek tragedians. He took this from Sophocles in his nevermore statements. He says nevermore over and over and over in the poem, The Raven. The informed reader knows he's quoting nevermore, not ever, oude, from Sophocles. And Homer uses that also. Now, the three fates, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, used these words, and it was signifying something's never, it's not going to happen. Never, not never. Oude, never, not never. And so the nevermore in the poem is evoking all of that. If you take classical literature, if I end up making videos of classical literature, possibly might start doing that next year in 2024. But the fates, Clotho was the fate who wove the cloth of your life. And Lachesis is the one who measured the cloth of your life and decided, when you were done living. And then Atropos, the origin of our word atrophy, is the one with the scissors who then cut the fabric of your life, and that's when you die. So when they say not ever, when they say oude, not ever, no, not ever, never, they mean it. If you are in ancient Greece, 400 years BC. And so Poe is using that, which is really a mastery. That's one of the instances where American lit kind of intersects with classical lit, because in classical lit, Sophocles, 500 BC, is a tragedian before Christ. So his tragedies have no redemption possibility. And those are, so the tragedies, the Greek tragedians, Sophocles, Euripides, and I'm slipping my mind because I'm teaching American Lit, so be it. So there's no redemption possible. And in Shakespeare, when you're 1600 years after Christ, the tragic figures still have opportunity. At the very end of the play, they can repent, they can die really well, they can even die on stage if they repent, things like that. So Poe is using the fates, who are 300 or 400 BC, to write a darker version of loss, because that his loss is a loss without hope or a future. He's not a Christian, so it's more of a Greek tragedian type of loss. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides. I finally came up with his name. In this 1845 poem, Poe is in despair. His first cousin wife, Virginia, married him when she was 13. He was 27. I'm a little repetitive, I can tell today, but he was really devoted to her. In fact, she inspired his poem, Annabel Lee, which is just beautiful. Sadly, Virginia contracted TB and she deteriorated really quickly. So she'd be like coughing herself to death. It'd just be horrible. Eventually, coughing up pieces of your lungs and blood and things like that. So she died at only 24, and Poe died 2 years later when he was 40. He was found delirious, and I told you that. The causes of his death are really conjecture. Nobody knows, but he was known to hallucinate. He would go running around at night, knocking on people's doors in the middle of the night and telling them that he was being chased by monsters and things like that. He always thought that somebody was following him or that something was after him, like a monster, something that only he could see or hear. There are no pictures of his poem, of his wife, except in her coffin. So artists kind of recreate from her coffin drawing, recreate her standing by Poe, but she looks a little bit on the dead side to me. Go ahead and turn to page 16 in your Dover copy and hold your finger there. We're going to be reading just a few stanzas out loud. Poe wrote these lines as Virginia was sick and dying. Page 16 in 101 American Poems, The Raven, written in 1845. Virginia is, coughing herself to death. She's sick and dying. And it's written, if you care, in trochaic octameter. And the meter and the rhythm of this poem is what I want you to hear as I read it. There are 18, I believe, 18 stanzas, and we won't read them all. We'll just read a few. The first, of course, is the most famous. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, "only this and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here for evermore. And of course, Lenore is just a euphemistic name for his wife. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with the fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more." Deep into the darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Stanza 7. Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly years of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas. That means a bust of Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, Pallas Athena, another Greek classical allusion from another class, classical lit. Perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. You may have seen pictures of the raven on the internet with Edgar Allan Poe with a picture of Pallas Athena perched upon his chamber door. Stanza 8. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, through the crest, though the crest be shorn and shaven, though, said I, art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore, tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. And Plutonian is from the god Pluto, who's the god of the underworld, darkness, and all of that. From on the night's Plutonian shore, quoth the raven, nevermore. And I'll stop there. I think 8 out of 16 is enough. But now you can understand how you're supposed to read it. So I challenge you to try and read it metrically like that. It is a cool poem, The Raven. And he had an incredible mastery of the English language to be able to write with that type of a meter. Really incredible. Okay, moving on. The Telltale Heart. Now, this is a short story, so you'll need to get out your Great American Short Story book. This is a short story. We'll look at it in just a minute. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, filled with eerie symbolism and irony. The genre would be occult fiction, and it is a monologue. Our speaker is a murderer. He's going to try to convince us that he's not mad or insane. He should be trying to convince us that he's innocent, right? But the narrator, by him insisting so strongly that he's assuredly sane, the reader becomes aware that he is assuredly insane. Poe is so insistent that he's able to produce a near hysteria in the story if you read it right. The Thelma read aloud, I try to do some of that, but I don't try to scare you to death. And of course, this copy of the short story published as well, this is actually a little movie, I think. Boy, I wouldn't watch that. Matt Damon and Clint Eastwood. No, I wouldn't watch that. But the Telltale Heart shows the perpetrator as he opens the door a little tiny bit. The light shines upon this old man's eye, and his eye is unnatural. There's something wrong with his eye, and that drives the guy to become a lunatic. The man believes he's logical and analytical, but it's in a contradictory way. He can reason and he can plan, but he can't tell right from wrong. Now, what do you think? What would you say the theme of this story is? What about, and I think a good theme for this story is righteousness. Applying logic and reason doesn't do any good without morals to direct them. And of course, this guy's crazy, so it gets a little bit difficult. The mad narrator justifies his actions by his efforts to make his innocent victim the guilty party. He blames his actions on the evil eye of the old man, as he calls it. And that's how the narrator justifies himself. Now, Poe, they think he probably had major heart problems. Could be something he was born with, could be something that his alcoholism induced. We will never know. But he had major health problems. And it's possible that this heart issue, that might have provided inspiration for the short story. If he had heart palpitations or his heart went into racing or something like that. Buried here, if you can't read it yourself, Edgar Allan Poe, let's see, original burial place. And then I guess they moved him. Mrs. Maria Clem, his mother-in-law, lies upon his right, and Virginia Poe, his wife, upon his left, under the monument erected to him in this cemetery. And you can see that there are still flowers there. People still drop flowers there. If you go and visit the grave of a great writer or a poet, people typically leave flowers. They would write out their own poems and roll them up and tie them up so they're beautiful and leave that at the grave as kind of an offering to Poe, or even leave pins. And very often people leave pebbles or rocks or coins, because that tells somebody that someone was there. It's a way for any family, even though there really isn't any, it's a way for people to know that there are still people visiting that grave. It's kind of a way to honor his grave, is to leave something there. Now, Poe is obsessed. He was obsessed with paranormal psychological experience. Ghost stories were his favorite. If you like ghost stories, you're going to love Edgar Allan Poe, and you're going to want his story, dead people who talk or evil people. And the action for this story, Telltale Heart, takes place at night, of course. The main character experiences eerie, irrational behavior and extreme emotional responses. And Poe just favors writing about the criminal mind. And of course, this is a criminal. It's written as a monologue. So the author, I mentioned before, is a murderer. There's the bust of Pallas Athena and the raven sitting on top of it. Athena always wears usually she's shown with a helmet so that you know it's Athena. But he's trying to convince we, the readers, that he's not crazy. And actually, he should be trying to convince us that he's innocent, isn't it? So this is a dark, occultic, gothic romanticism. So let's take a look. And I found this great image. This, again, the door creaking open just a little bit and the light falling on the poor man's bad eye. So let's see. I have to find the Telltale Heart. I have to find the page number now of the Telltale Heart. There we go, page 13. Page 13 in Great American Short Stories. And of course, there's a Thelma read aloud of this. And I try to read it dramatically. But let's read just a few lines so that you can go home today and feel like you know what it's going to be about. You already started it, and you know you won't read it late at night. The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. True, nervous, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all it was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none, passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. And whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold. And so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him, and every night about midnight. And you can read the rest by yourself. Yep, don't read it late at night. Moving on. All right, we're going to read another short story from our Great American Short Stories, GASS, Great American Short Stories, one from Nathaniel Hawthorne. We're going to be reading Young Goodman Brown. It starts on page 1. In this short story, we're going to see Puritan themes, or what Nathaniel Hawthorne thinks are Puritan themes: sin, guilt, and then hypocrisy. When Goodman Brown leaves his wife Faith behind to spend the night in the woods, it's kind of like he's leaving his actual faith behind. And you know by this time that Puritans used names that reflected virtues. It's kind of like if you took Britlit, like what we saw in Everyman, where the characters had names for virtue: charity, faith, grace, mercy, or patience. and that those are names that are just virtues. And the Puritans used names like that also. And his wife's name is Faith. The term goodman was used for a respectable married man, somebody who was in good standing with the church. So he's Goodman Brown. Hawthorne wrote this story in 1835, and this is 175 years after the age of the Puritans ended. So this isn't a story about Puritans written by a Puritan. It's not like Anne Bradstreet or William Bradford. This is a story mocking Puritans, written by a romantic writer, and Hawthorne here is making a parody of Puritan beliefs, but you need to be familiar with it. It's an allegory filled with symbolism. It's an analysis of Puritans and the strict moral code that they imposed on society. They tried to live that way, but they also imposed it on everybody else. And so at times, yes, of course, they could be hypocrites. And it suggests that even the most devout and virtuous individuals are susceptible to temptation and corruption, and that the line between good and evil is not always clear. Now, this is true, but for the Puritans, they still had those laws and that moral code, and at least they tried to live that way. Key symbols. This is an allegorical story, so everything has meaning, everything is a symbol. Know that the forest presents dark temptation. So young Goodman Brown leaves home to go into the forest for the night, and he leaves his wife, Faith, behind, leaving his faith behind, allegorically. So the forest is a dark temptation, but he's going in anywhere. It's where Goodman Brown goes, and he's going to face his temptation. And will he fail, or will he go back home? It's the inward dark side of human nature, the natural man that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 7. Remember, Paul says, that I don't want to do, that's what I do. And what I do want to do, that's not what I do. And young Goodman Brown is really fighting it. And I'll just tell you now, he gives in. So young Goodman Brown faces the devil in the forest. We actually see the devil, and he thinks he sees and then loses his faith. And then they're both just really sad at the end of the book. But it's a short story. Other symbols, the pink ribbons represent his wife, because she is always wearing these beautiful pink ribbons. And that's kind of symbolic of her innocence and her pure walk with the Lord, until he sees her pink ribbons in the forest. Now, remember, this story is not written by a Christian. Nathaniel Hawthorne sees only the hypocrisy. He doesn't see the spiritual struggle that ends with victory in the Christian life. He just sees the hypocrisy, and he's making them all hypocrites. His characters' struggles end in defeat. They don't make it. Other things to look for: the devil's staff. This is a big deal. It symbolizes the power that Satan has over this world. Will Goodman Brown resist to the point of victory, or is he going to fail? And of course, this is Nathaniel Hawthorne. He's not a Christian, so Goodman Brown is going to fail. Now, the serpent is, of course, representative of Satan, and that's just, robbed right out of Genesis for the serpent. Another symbol is to know the names. The names of the characters represent virtues. Young Goodman Brown himself represents anybody who's religious, very similar to the medieval play Everyman that we read in Britlit. Goodman Brown represents the religious hypocrisy, though, that Hawthorne sees all around him. And Goodman Brown's wife, Faith, represents his faith. When he loses his faith, if he loses his faith, his wife, he's losing his faith, allegorically, and with his faith, which is apparently dependent upon his wife's faith. This short story, it's just got symbolism everywhere, but it is based on a non-believer's perspective. So that's how you're going to judge the story. It's not written by a Christian. Christians who are familiar with William Bradford, Anne Bradstreet, Mary Rowlandson, Richard Baxter, or Thomas Brooks, you have had samples of all of these Puritans, not to mention the Puritans were meeting anonymously in the Valley of Vision. We would not call them hypocrites. They may try and fail sometimes, but we would never call them hypocrites. This story, along with his novel, The Scarlet Letter, paint the Puritans in a very modernist light, judging them harshly, with no room allowed for human error. Hawthorne rewrites history when his works are chosen to represent Puritans. When teachers in American schools choose The Scarlet Letter or young Goodman Brown to represent Puritans, rather than read Bradford, Bradstreet, Rowlandson, Baxter, or Brooks, when they choose to read the Scarlet Letter, he is, in essence, rewriting history because they decide that's what the Puritans were like. It's really sad. Young Goodman Brown. So our story is an allegory of the dangers of leaving your faith behind. It's filled with imagery, symbolism. It's from 1835, it mocks Puritan beliefs. It implies that they are paranoid about witches, that they think witches are around every corner. He turns their concern for purity into this dark obsession. It's his view. Themes include superstition, sin, guilt, and hypocrisy. Turn to page 1 in your Great American Short Stories, and we'll look at Nathaniel Hawthorne. Of course, there's a Thelma read aloud now, and I will read it and kind of explain it to you along the way. I think it's what, 34 minutes long. So it's worth your time, and then you'll understand. But you do need to know this was written, if you want to write it in your copy, written in 1835. This is a good 175 years after the Puritan age ended. From page 1. Young Goodman Brown came forth at sunset into the street of Salem Village. Of course, it takes place in Salem, Massachusetts. But put his head back after crossing the threshold to exchange a parting kiss with his young wife. And Faith, as the wife was aptly named, thrust her own pretty head into the street, letting the wind play with the pink ribbons of her cap while she called to Goodman Brown. "Dearest heart," whispered she, softly and rather sadly, when her lips were close to his ear, "prithee, put off your journey until sunrise and sleep in your own bed tonight. A lone woman is troubled with such dreams and such thoughts that she's afeard of herself sometimes. Pray tarry with me this night, dear husband, of all nights in the year." "My faith and my love and my faith," replied young Goodman Brown, "of all nights in the year, this one night must I tarry away from thee. My journey, as thou callest it, forth and back again, must needs be done twixt now and sunrise. So it has to be done at night. What, my sweet pretty wife, dost thou doubt me already, and we but 3 months married?" Then God bless you," said Faith with the pink ribbons, "and may you find all well when you come back." "Amen," cried Goodman Brown. "Say thy prayers, dear Faith, and go to bed at dusk, and no harm will come to thee." So they parted, and the young man pursued his way until, being about to turn the corner of the meeting house, he looked back and saw the head of Faith still peeping after him with a melancholy air, in spite of her pink ribbons. "Poor little Faith," thought he, for his heart smote him. "What a wretch am I to leave her on such an errand. She talks of dreams, too." Methought as she spoke, there was trouble in her face, as if a dream had warned her what work is to be done tonight. But no, 'twould kill her to think of it. Well, she's a blessed angel on earth, and after this one night, I'll cling to her skirts and follow her to heaven. So Goodman Brown is saying, I'll just do this one more time, and then I'm going to do everything good. This is exactly what people say to themselves. I'll just do it one more time. Okay, continuing in the little story. With this excellent resolve for the future, Goodman Brown felt himself justified in making more haste on his present evil purpose. He had taken a dreary road, darkened by all the gloomiest trees of the forest, which barely stood aside to let the narrow path creep through, and closed immediately behind. It was all as lonely as could be, and there in this peculiarity, in such a solitude that the traveler knows not who may be concealed by the innumerable trunks and the thick boughs overhead, so that with lonely footsteps he may yet be passing through an unseen multitude. "There may be a devilish Indian behind every tree," said Goodman Brown to himself, and he glanced fearfully behind him as he added, "What if the devil himself should be at my very elbow?" His head being turned back, he passed a crook of the road, and looking forward again, beheld the figure of a man in grave and decent attire, seated at the foot of an old tree. He arose at Goodman Brown's approach and walked onward side by side with him. "You are late, Goodman Brown," said he. "The clock of the Old South was striking as I came through Boston, and that is full 15 minutes agone." Faith kept me back a while," replied the young man with a tremor in his voice, caused by the sudden appearance of his companion, though not wholly unexpected. And the staff and the snake are just in the next paragraph. I think you're going to have some fun with that story, except it really is too bad to have Nathaniel Hawthorne make fun of the Puritans this way and mock everything about them. Faith kept him for a while, literally his wife Faith, but allegorically his faith kept him a while. He thought about not going on this errand where he's meeting up with the devil in the forest. If you listen to the Thelma read aloud of young Goodman Brown, 34 minutes long, listen to that story and you'll understand it. And we do have to understand Nathaniel Hawthorne. We have to understand that all of your peers are learning about the Puritans from reading Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. And you learned about the Puritans from reading the Puritans. And this is quite a big deal that you know the Puritans, you know who they are. And so you also need to know Nathaniel Hawthorne. So don't feel bad that you have to read the eerie things or Hawthorne. Okay, Great American Short Stories. That's what mine looks like, but I understand that maybe yours doesn't look like this. I think it has a new cover now. But what are you doing? What's your writing assignment this week? Your assignment from Great American Short Stories is a whole list of vocabulary words. And I realize they're a long list. They are arranged in order with the page numbers where you will find them. And I do suggest that you look them up and find out what the words mean and get your paper kind of ready before you start reading so that you can look up the vocabulary words. Of course, if you listen to the Thelma read aloud, I'll tell you. So these are due next week. And then there's a reading quiz also next week. So you've got vocabulary from Young Goodman Brown and from The Telltale Heart. Now, Young Goodman Brown, to think about, what do you think the theme of this story is? I told you earlier. What do you think the theme is? Sin, hypocrisy, yes, faith or false faith, hypocrisy. The Telltale Heart by Poe. How is that story romantic? You know a little bit about the story now. How is that story romantic? It's dark romanticism, isn't it? Where we explore eerie things, paranormal things, things that there are no explorations for. And some people love that literature, but you get to meet Poe this week. So the vocabulary words need to be defined in context, as I mentioned before, and their definitions are due next week. And I suggest that besides the definition, that you also use each word properly. And then these 4 words, sagacity, audacity, vehemently, and gesticulations, you need to know what that is. I hope by now you know what it is to gesticulate. Some people talk with their hands. And sometimes as I'm talking to you, making these videos, I'm talking with my hands and they're waving all over the place. You're really blessed that you're not seeing my hands as they wave all over the place. It is how I talk. You might have to look up sagacious, audacious, vehement, or gesticulate instead of gesticulations or vehemently. And so I'm giving you the heads up on these words, but you need to know what those are. Next week, you need to know what those are. Okay, what about Nathaniel Hawthorne? What was he like? He was friends and neighbors with some of New England's most well-known intellectuals, including the Bronsons and Bronson Alcott, and then his daughter, Louisa May Alcott, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was also prominent in the Transcendentalist movement. So this guy is famous even when he is young. Hawthorne was born in Salem, Massachusetts, where it all happened. And why do you think he turned into a skeptic? His great-great-great-grandfather, John, was a judge in the Salem witch trials. I think the witch trials were 1692, something like that. You can see that falls. He is definitely an adult by that time. And his grandfather was an adult and a judge during those witch trials. Judge John Hawthorne was one of the few judges and people involved with those witchcraft trials who never made a public confession of repentance for having participated in the witch hunts. Pretty much everybody else said they were sorry, repented, and said they were sorry because they had to. So he may be holding this against his great-great-great-grandfather, who he never met. But it's tricky, do you give him a leeway for that to make fun of the Puritans because his grandfather didn't repent? Hawthorne published many short stories. Then he wrote The Scarlet Letter, the novel, around the time of Uncle Tom's Cabin, believe it or not, and around the time of Darwin publishing The Origin of the Species. Amazing, isn't it? Hawthorne was not a Puritan. This is a cool set of Hawthorne stories, the Twice Told Tales. If you like kind of some scary stories, you might really enjoy Nathaniel Hawthorne. And they're not all scary, some are just kind of weird. But you just have to remember he was not a Puritan. He's a romantic, and he's a dark romantic, but he's not a Puritan. He doesn't represent the Puritans. He joined the Transcendentalist community at Brook Farm, then in Salem, and then later in Europe. His writing is inspired by his own view of the Puritans, including his own ancestors. And you need to know that. That's his great, great, great grandfather, who was even earlier than that to get to the Puritans. And although Hawthorne is historically far removed from any real Puritan, his work remains the standard for American literature classes across America studying the Puritans. And that is just plain sad, that The Scarlet Letter is how young people in America learn about the Puritans. Hawthorne's works are referred to as Gothic or dark romance because they explore that dark side of human nature that is unregenerate, very similar to Poe, but not quite as macabre as Poe. He focuses on sin and the evil that men are capable of doing. His stories often explore human psychology or the complex nature of the human propensity towards sin. Hawthorne was educated in Salem away from his family. His father died in 1808 when he was just a little, toddler, leaving him to be raised by his mother and other relatives, including uncles and aunts. And I can't tell you how many authors who turn out to be quite cynical were raised by all women or without both parents or without either parent. Family makes a difference, doesn't it? His early interest in writing was apparent in the multiple issues of a newspaper that he published when he was only 16. And it was all handwritten and hand drawn. And I'm going to guess that there are at least a couple of you out there who have done the same thing, published a family newspaper that you drew all by yourself, wrote it all out, made the columns, give it a title, all of that, make your own little newspaper or magazine, handwritten and drawn. But it kind of shows that he was born to be a writer. His Scarlet Letter, that novel sold 2,500 copies in 10 days. Some critics objected to the book's morbid intensity. The book, similar in style and content to his short story, Young Goodman Brown, focuses on the psychology of sin, hypocrisy, and human nature. It's Gothic or dark romanticism. And you have a syllabus synopsis of the Scarlet Letter in your syllabus, pages 185 to 89. If you're one of those people who has figured out that the syllabus is usually not quiz about, and so you don't read the syllabus, you're really missing out on a lot of American lit. It's like not reading the textbook. That syllabus is our textbook, hundreds of pages though it be. And you need to read the syllabus so that you have the full picture of American literature. And this will give you the synopsis. If you're going to take a CLEP test, CLEP, to get a college credit for this class, you will have to read The Scarlet Letter, and you'll also have to read The Red Badge of Courage. You'll have to read those two things, and probably a little more poetry. There are sample CLEP tests on the internet. You can just Google in CLEP test American Lit sample and find some free samples and test yourself to see how much you have learned. But the Scarlet Letter was really popular, and you can kind of see how he would write the character as the character in the Scarlet Letter is somebody who doesn't repent, and his whole life is all messed up because he doesn't repent, because he suffers from that guilt. And I think he's thinking about his great, great, great grandpa when he writes that Scarlet Letter. He died while on a mountain tour in part of the Appalachians in New Hampshire. He was buried in what is called now the Author's Ridge. It's an area in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery at Concord, of course, Concord, Massachusetts. Present at his burial were other literary greats. Longfellow, Emerson, and Alcott. And you can see that it simply says Hawthorne. And as I mentioned to you before, you can see that people have left pebbles, pine cones, walking sticks, uh, who knows what else people have left there. They're just showing their respect by leaving something. If you do that at gravesites now, they don't like it because they want to be able to mow around things. In fact, you can't even have headstones now. Most cemeteries, you have to have a level with the ground marker so that they can just mow right over it, which is really sad. You can't, because these require human attention and two hands and somebody to get down on their hands and knees and trim around these standing headstones. But that ends our lesson for today. And you now have time to talk about that vocabulary assignment and what's expected to you from that. And the Lord bless you. And I will see you next week. Bye.